aerial sweep low over red country, a wide paddock, a weathered homestead, a leather ledger open to a handwritten list of runs. The name Kidman sits on a faded plan, a pastoral name woven into parts of the outback. But those ledger columns point to something more than local fame, land treated as long-term capital, decisions written down that lasted across generations. That quiet contrast between public respect and private ownership shaped towns, station work, and country life. This film follows how those holdings were built, the moments that changed control, and the ordinary people who felt the consequences, and it ends where the map still keeps its traces. The drover who bought the map. A man on horseback moves a line across a dry horizon, the camera closes on a hand that signs a paper, then on a small, battered ledger where place names pile up. It's the image of a practical ambition, knowledge of country turned into maps and then into the ledger of ownership. That practical impulse is the simplest root of the story we are telling, how an understanding of stock, seasons, and routes became the first step toward long-term landholding and influence. Sidney Kidman's name appears in many accounts as the person who first stitched together widely separated runs. The details of his earliest purchases and the exact sequence of leases require careful archival confirmation, but the pattern the record points to is clear: a drover's expertise could be converted into a portfolio of stations. What mattered was not only the size of any single holding, but the way stations were chosen and connected across different ecological zones, linked to railheads and market towns, so that stock could be mustered, moved, and sold with an eye to drought and the seasons. That strategy was born of practical necessity. Pastoral Australia was, and remains, a landscape of variable rainfall and shifting opportunity. Owning land in more than one district reduced the risk that any single drought or pasture failure would destroy the whole operation. Accounts suggest that thinking in terms of networks, of stations that could be grazed in rotation or used to move cattle seasonally, was a form of risk management as much as a business plan. In that sense, land ceased to be only a place to run stock, it became a tool for smoothing volatility and, crucially, a store of value that could be passed down or used as collateral. How this translated into wealth and influence was not automatic. Running widely dispersed stations required logistics, reliable stock routes, access to railheads for moving cattle to market, and relationships with meatworks and agents in regional towns and ports. The development of rail links and refrigeration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries expanded national markets and made larger-scale pastoral operations commercially viable in a new way. Those infrastructure shifts mattered. They connected remote homesteads to urban consumers and export chains, turning seasonal grazing into a commercial enterprise with national reach. It is also important to recognize the social standing that followed land control. In rural districts, a substantial station was not merely a productive asset, it was a focal point for employment, local spending, and community life. Homesteads could function as employers, shelters for itinerant workers during musters, and patrons of nearby shops and services. Over time, this material presence translated into social recognition. The name attached to a station, often the family name of the owner, became part of local identity. That social recognition is one reason pastoral holdings carried an influence that extended beyond the balance sheet and into civic life. Yet the act of accumulating stations was not simply a romantic tale of frontier skill. Turning scattered leases into an integrated holding required money, credit, and legal mechanisms. The pastoral lease system made land available under conditions that suited pastoral expansion in that era. At the same time, the realities of financing station improvements and sustaining stock during hard seasons meant that pastoralists had to engage with banks, agents, and markets. The ledger that opened our chapter is a small image of this commercial reality, columns of place names and entries that track operations, costs, and the business of holding land over time. From a broader viewpoint, what began as pragmatic decisions, buy here because the seasons are different, hold that run because it offers summer pasture, accumulated into a different kind of power. Land, once acquired in multiple places and held across generations, functions as lasting capital. It can generate income, underpin social standing, and be deployed in legal and financial forms that extend a family's influence. That is the old money mechanism at work in pastoral Australia, not conspicuous consumption, but the slow concentration of assets in place that can persist where other forms of wealth might be more volatile. For ordinary people on and around these stations, the consequences were tangible. Employment opportunities, patterns of seasonal work, and the presence of a station owner in civic life shaped towns and households. Local economies could come to rely on station-driven spending. Supply chains emerged to service the pastoral business. At the same time, the consolidation of land into the hands of a few had ramifications for neighboring selectors, smallholders, and for the broader distribution of pastoral opportunity across the region. Though social effects are part of the ledger's shadow, the practical business of holding land interacts with community life in ways that are rarely neutral. This chapter has shown the invention at the heart of the Kidman story, a set of practical choices by people who knew the land, an emerging market infrastructure that connected remote stations to national demand, and a legal and financial context that allowed land to be accumulated and held. The result was a form of power rooted in place, durable, often quiet, and sometimes at odds with the public impression of pastoral life as simply local or bucolic. What follows is how that early, pragmatic strategy scaled, how stations were linked, how routes and railheads became arteries of a pastoral network, and how a name attached to a handful of homesteads came to signify a wider pattern of landholding and influence. Stations across a continent. A map appears again, this time not as an idea but as a working document, routes penciled between homesteads, pins marking water, rails circled in red. The map shows the logic: stations placed so cattle could be moved clear of drought, sent to the nearest railhead, or mustered toward pastures that recovered sooner. It is a picture of risk management rather than mere accumulation. The decision to hold country in different climatic zones was practical. Some runs provided feed in summer, others held green feed in winter. A dry spell in one district could be offset by pasture several hundred kilometers away. Pastoral operators who thought in these spatial terms could keep stock moving and production ongoing when single property owners could not. Over time, that spatial thinking became a distinctive business model: land as a distributed asset, operating across seasons and linked by routes, not simply a patch of ground to be farmed. Logistics made the model possible. The expanding rail network and regional saleyards turned remote homesteads into nodes in a national supply chain. Where droving once meant weeks on the road, railheads allowed carcasses or live cattle to reach market more reliably. Refrigeration and better transport pushed pastoralism into larger market circuits, so stations within striking distance of transport nodes had very different commercial options than isolated blocks. The placement of stations therefore reflected both ecological judgment and access to transport and processing facilities. Running a network of stations demanded organization. Station managers and drovers coordinated musters, timed movements, and negotiated with carriers. Communication was slower than today's standards, yet managers developed routines and protocols, seasonal timetables, shared knowledge about waterholes, and local agreements with carriers and meatworks. Financially, operations required credit lines for seasonal feed or stock maintenance. Land was used as collateral and as a means of smoothing the cash flow challenges inherent to pastoral work. The ledger that opened our film is one image of that administration: columns recording runs, stock movements and costs, a paper trail of how land and livestock were turned into ongoing business. That transformation, from working homestead to component of a wider network, had social as well as economic consequences. Stations employing local workers sustained towns by spending on supplies, paying wages, and attracting services. In many regional centers, the cattle trade underpinned butcheries, carriers, and saddlery shops. Stations were customers and patrons. The social reach of a station network also extended to seasonal work patterns. Muster seasons determined when drovers and shearers moved through a region, when stores needed stock, and when hotels saw the swell of trade. In short, the network shaped everyday life in towns and districts, creating. At the same time, holding land across wide areas concentrated a form of power that was not theatrical but influential nonetheless. Families or groups that controlled multiple runs could exercise sustained economic weight in a region. They provided employment and services, and their economic decisions, to hold, sell, invest in improvements, had ripple effects. The consequence for local communities could be stabilizing in prosperous years, and destabilizing when pressures mounted. The pattern of landholding matters not only for accounts but for who made local decisions and who had a long-term stake in a district. There was also a technical aspect to managing such a system. Stock routes needed maintenance, fences and boreholes required investment, and coordinating movements across hundreds of kilometers required trusted local managers. The record suggests that some pastoralists reinvested profits into property improvements and logistics precisely because the network depended on reliable on-the-ground infrastructure. These investments turned land into operating capital, improvements enhanced productivity and, by extension, the asset value of stations over generations. This was not an insulated, self-contained economy. Market linkages meant that urban demand and international conditions could influence decisions on remote stations. Fluctuations in cattle prices, shipping capacity at ports, or changes in meatworks processing regimes affected returns. When the external market shifted, station owners had to choose between selling stock, mortgaging land, or holding through a downturn, decisions that played out across the network rather than on a single property. The resulting financial arrangements, credit, mortgages, and leases, became as important as paddock management in sustaining the system. For ordinary people in the districts, the network's operation shaped work and opportunity. Muster schedules dictated when casual labor was needed, carriers and stock agents earned livelihoods from the flows of cattle, town businesses timed supplies to pastoral demand. Where a network operated smoothly, towns could enjoy steady trade. Where pressure built on stations, the effects could be felt in shop fronts and on worker availability. These patterns tied everyday life to decisions taken at homesteads and in ledgers far from the towns they affected. Yet the same connectivity that made networks resilient also created new vulnerabilities. Dependence on particular transport nodes or processing facilities meant that a disruption in one link could reverberate widely. Environmental shocks that once affected a single station became pressures on entire networks when multiple properties faced similar conditions or when market closures curtailed options. Holding a distributed portfolio of land reduced some risks but introduced dependencies on infrastructure, finance, and management capable of coordinating across distance. As these operational systems matured, an image of pastoral stability grew up around them: prominent homesteads, regular musters, and the visible flow of stock. That public image suggested permanence and local centrality. But a closer view, through ledgers and maps, shows a network constantly managed, repaired and rerouted, a business built on land but kept running by human labor, infrastructure and financial arrangements. The map's pins were not simply markers of ownership, they were nodes in an economic and social system that required continual attention. Understanding how stations were linked, and why they were located where they were, helps explain the form of power that would later be called old money in pastoral country. It is not the flash of urban wealth but the slow accumulation of interconnected place-based assets that tied families to districts and provided them with channels of influence. That pattern sets the stage for the next set of pressures, the fiscal and administrative challenges of maintaining such a network across generations, and the signs that those challenges were beginning to surface. When a name meant country. A town main street framed by gum trees, a homestead on a rise with a row of outbuildings, a newspaper masthead on brittle paper that names a local pastoralist in the same breath as regional leaders. These are the visible traces of a name that came to mean more than a property owner. It became a regional reference point, a shorthand for employment, supply, and local identity. Contemporary newspapers and local accounts often treated prominent pastoral names as part of civic life. Profiles, obituaries and market reports linked station owners to public events, to charitable donations and to the rhythms of district seasons. That public presence carried weight. When a station required contractors, town businesses supplied them. When muster season arrived, hotels and stores prepared for the influx. The station's economic role made its name familiar not only to their immediate workers but to shopkeepers, carriers, and townsfolk who judged the year by the movement of cattle. The social effect was reinforced by physical markers. Large homesteads, well-maintained yards and signage functioned as landmarks. Place names, roads, creeks, sometimes local institutions, often reflected long associations with particular runs. Such markers anchored memory in landscape and in community rituals, shows, races, auctions and annual musters that punctuated rural life and kept the station name in pub. That recognition also translated into a kind of informal authority. A family name attached to substantial holdings could command attention in local councils, in discussions about transport and in the networks that arranged seasonal labor. Where pastoralists were significant employers, their decisions influenced not only markets but civic rhythms. The reputational capital built through visible engagement and steady presence became part of the establishment of regional society. At the same time, public esteem could obscure the ledger's less visible realities. A polished homestead and civic engagement suggested permanence, while the day-to-day work involved careful balancing of stock, feed and credit. Accounts and contemporary reports point to a recurrent tension, respect for prominent pastoral names alongside practical vulnerabilities rooted in climate and markets. The prestige attached to a family or station could mask the administrative burdens of sustaining widely spread runs and the dependence on outside services and infrastructure. For towns shaped by pastoral networks, the name meant both continuity and contingency, a reliable source of trade in ordinary years, and a focal point for anxiety if pastoral conditions deteriorated. That duality, public recognition on one side, operational fragility on the other, sets the stage for where strains might appear in the record, in ledgers, in legal arrangements, in decisions about holding or selling land. The next pressures to examine are those less visible burdens that began to accumulate beneath the surface of public respect. The costs you could not see. An empty yard can look peaceful on a still afternoon. A closer view finds a different record, a ledger with sparse entries, a note about freight costs, a penciled remark on feed purchases. Those quiet pages point to ongoing pressures that rarely show on a homestead's neat facade. Operating a network of stations protected against some risks, yet it introduced. One persistent pressure was the climate itself. Pastoralists managed a landscape of variable rainfall where droughts recurred. Owning runs in different districts spread risk, though prolonged dry seasons could still strain resources across the network. When pasture failed in multiple places, the costs of feed, water, and stock maintenance rose. Contemporary accounts suggest that environmental cycles were a constant operational factor, something owners had to plan for while also meeting market commitments. Financial arrangements were the second layer of vulnerability. Maintaining remote homesteads, repairing fences, sinking bores and arranging droving or transport required capital. Records indicate station owners used credit and informal arrangements with agents and suppliers to bridge seasonal shortfalls. That credit carried obligations, calls on assets, interest charges, and administrative complexity. Managing widely separated properties meant more accounts, more intermediaries, and more points where cash flows could be squeezed. Succession introduced another set of pressures. Passing land and responsibilities across generations required legal arrangements and estate planning. Trust instruments or corporate entities sometimes appeared in the record as mechanisms to hold and manage property. These structures could preserve continuity, yet they also changed who made decisions. The form of ownership, individual, family trust, company, affected tax, management, and the ability to respond quickly to operational strains. Evidence suggests that as holdings grew, so did the administrative demands of holding them. There were social and logistical costs too. Networks depended on reliable stock routes, carriers, and regional services. If a railhead shifted its timetables, or a meatworks changed procurement patterns, station operators needed to adapt quickly. That adaptability relied on local managers and contractors whose labor and knowledge kept the system running. The day-to-day work of mustering, maintaining water points and coordinating transport was essential, and when pressures mounted, the burden fell on those who carried out the work rather than the ledger entries that recorded the decisions. Finally, the presence of stations on country intersected with indigenous peoples' lives in complex ways. The archival record points to a variety of interactions, labor relationships, negotiated arrangements, and contested access that differ by place. Any fuller account requires careful, location-specific research and meaningful consultation with traditional owners. What is clear is that landholding at scale affected more than property boundaries. It touched on labor, on mobility, and on the uses of country that lay beyond commercial registers. These operational realities did not always show in public ceremonies or the polished image of a homestead. Instead, they accumulated in correspondence, in ledgers, and in decisions about maintenance, credit, and management. Over time, the administrative weight and exposure to environmental and market cycles began to shape strategic choices about what to hold and what to consider selling, setting up the decisive transactions and ownership changes that appear in the documentary record. The sales that rewrote the map. There are moments when a map changes not because new pins are added, but because someone redraws the ownership lines. Those moments leave a different kind of record: sale notices in regional papers, entries on land registers, files in a solicitor's archive. The ledger that once listed runs becomes matched by a stack of legal documents, and the pattern of places on the map begins to shift from an operating network to a portfolio of assets under new arrangements. Wherever those documents appear, they mark a turning point, the practical boundaries of old money power being renegotiated on paper. The archival traces are pragmatic: notices advertising properties for sale, land title entries transferring leases, corporate filings that shift who holds administrative control. Available evidence suggests such transactions occurred in phases rather than as a single dramatic event. Sometimes a station or group of runs was offered when maintenance costs and seasonal pressures mounted. In other instances, estate arrangements or managerial decisions led to formal restructuring. The documentary record of these transactions, when cross-checked against newspapers and land records, shows how ownership could be converted into liquidity or reorganized into legal forms that altered who exercised day-to-day control. Why would these sales happen? The answer is a concatenation of pressures: environmental exposure, logistical costs, estate and succession demands, and the need to service credit or to capitalize on market opportunities. Running widely separated stations had operational advantages. It also meant the owner faced multiple sources of costs simultaneously. When maintenance, bore sinking, repairs and transport bills accumulated, an owner might choose to monetize part of the holding to stabilize the remainder. Sale notices and title extracts serve as receipt moments in this history. An advertisement placed in a regional newspaper, a formal entry on a state land register, or a solicitor's file noting a transfer are tangible proofs that the map, the pattern of station ownership, was being redrawn. These items matter because they anchor narrative claims in public, verifiable sources. An auction notice confirms that a property reached market, a title record proves that legal ownership moved from one name to another, a corporate filing demonstrates that a different governance structure had been created. Those documents change the story from oral memory to traceable fact. Contemporaneous press coverage of sales reveals how communities read these changes. Reports often noted the sale without moral judgment, listing stations, and sometimes explaining that the sale reflected changing circumstances. For towns and service providers, a sale could signal uncertainty. New owners might bring new labor arrangement or investment, or they might hold the land as a passive asset. Newspaper accounts therefore functioned as both record and public conversation, documenting the immediate responses of markets, agents, and neighbors. The legal form of transfers also mattered. Moving land into a trust or a corporate entity changed who made strategic choices. An estate held directly by a family member involves different decision pathways than land held by a company board or trustees. Where documents show transfers into institutional forms, the capacity for rapid local decision-making could be reduced, and the priorities of those who controlled the assets could shift toward managing balance sheets rather than station improvement. That movement from personal stewardship to institutional administration is central to understanding how an old money posture can change in practice. The name on the homestead might remain, while the legal and financial logic behind decisions was transformed. These changes had practical consequences on the ground. Contractual obligations, such as mortgages or encumbrances, altered the options available to managers. Where a station was offered to market, local contractors and suppliers watched closely. A sale could mean continuity under a new owner, or it could mean a period of uncertainty during which maintenance and investment slowed. In districts where several stations changed hands in a short span, the cumulative effect could be a pause in local capital expenditure, with knock-on effects for carriers, shearers, and shopkeepers who depended on steady pastoral activity. It is important to separate routine commercial decisions from dramatic narratives of collapse. Some transactions were strategic and stabilizing, selling peripheral runs to concentrate resources on core operations, or restructuring to relieve tax or legal exposure. Other transfers reflected pressures, environmental and financial, that made holding extensive properties impractical. The nuance here matters. Sales can be instruments of survival as much as signs of decline. The documentary record shows examples of both patterns, indicating that the end result was often a reshaping of asset management rather than an unambiguous failure. When ownership shifted, the social dynamics shifted too. A long-standing local family might cede operational control to absent trustees or corporate managers who set different priorities. Community expectations about patronage, employment and local involvement could be unsettled when those who had historically taken responsibility for local initiatives stepped back. That social recalibration played out in town halls and councils where pastoral families once held informal authority. Newspapers and council minutes capture some of that reorientation, documenting debates about transport, infrastructure, and the town's economic future in light of changing land ownership patterns. For staff at stations, ownership change could mean new administrative procedures and, at times, changes in management style. Where legal ownership moved into entities less embedded in local life, everyday discretion, the ability of a station manager to decide on a repair, a hire, or a grazing rotation, sometimes became subject to centralized approval. That shift affected how problems were solved. Decisions that previously happened at homestead level could now require consultation with remote offices or trustees. The practical effect was slower responsiveness in some situations and a sense among local workers that the lines of authority had shifted. In several instances recorded in public documents, transfers were accompanied by statements about investment plans or intentions to modernize. Announcements of incoming owners planning improvements appeared in local press, and in some cases that happened. For communities, such promises could be a source of cautious optimism. For those studying old money legacies, these statements provide evidence about how new forms of ownership intended to deploy land as operating property, as income-generating assets, or as components of broader estate strategies. The intentions recorded alongside sales therefore help interpret whether a transfer signifies continuity, transformation, or a step toward institutionalization. Taken together, sale notices and title records mark moments where the geography of influence was renegotiated. The map no longer only recorded pastoral connections maintained by a single family's working knowledge, it began to reflect legal holdings, institutional priorities, and commercial choices visible on public registers. Each transfer altered the web of relationships that sustained regional economies. Suppliers, town businesses, carriers, and laborers reinterpreted their ties according to new ownership signals. For historians and communities alike, these documented transactions are the points at which practice. The ledger's columns, once entries of routine operations, can be read next to sale documents to see how continuity yielded to change. Tracing those transactions is essential. It clarifies when land shifted from being managed as an operating network to being treated, in part, as a set of assets subject to market logic and legal forms. That shift does not resolve easily into stories of loss or gain. Instead, it invites scrutiny of the human consequences and the institutional choices that followed. The next section turns from the records on paper to the people whose work and lives were entangled with those transactions, revealing how communities lived through the redrawing of maps. Who carried the work? A shearing shed at dawn offers an ordinary image: corrugated roofs, a line of empty pens, the smell of lanolin in the air. Those structures are where the abstract mechanics of landholding meet everyday labor. The stations only functioned because people turned up to muster, feed, doctor stock and run the yards. Their hands, knowledge and endurance were the practical engine of the pastoral network. When ownership and legal arrangements shifted on paper, it was these workers and local communities who felt the consequences in daily life. The labor that kept stations going was diverse and seasonal. Station managers coordinated rosters, drovers and stockmen moved cattle along routes, shearers and shed hands processed wool, contractors maintained bores and fences. Many of these roles demanded skill and local knowledge: where to find a bore in drought, how to read country after a dry season, how to move stock safely over long distances. Those skills were not easily replaced by distant administration. The practical reality recorded in station papers and local reports is that operations relied on people who knew the land intimately and who carried institutional memory in ways ledgers could not. For towns tied to pastoral networks, the rhythms of work shaped economic and social life. Seasonal musters and shearing seasons brought predictable demand to hotels, stores, and carriers. Suppliers timed their deliveries to coincide with muster flows. Blacksmiths, saddlers, and stock agents planned their seasons around station timetables. When a cluster of stations changed hands, or when maintenance slowed because of deferred investment, that ripple could be observed in shop fronts and in local hiring patterns. Contemporary reports and local records suggest that towns experienced these effects as shifts in trade and labor availability rather than as abstract balance sheet outcomes. Indigenous relationships to station work were complex and vary by region. In many districts, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were involved in station labor, drawing on deep knowledge of country and contributing labor in a range of roles. Accounts and oral histories indicate that these interactions included employment, negotiated arrangements, and patterns of seasonal work. At the same time, the overlay of pastoral leases on traditional country reshaped mobility, access, and customary uses of land. A careful, place-specific account is required to understand these dynamics fully. It is clear that large-scale landholding affected Indigenous peoples in ways that extended beyond economic employment to questions of access, rights, and cultural practice. When ownership or management structures changed, whether through sales, transfers into trusts, or institutional administration, the operational implications showed in everyday decisions. Where local managers had previously been able to decide on immediate repairs or to hire locally, new administrative layers sometimes required approvals or shifted priorities toward cost management. That could slow responses to urgent maintenance needs or alter hiring practices. For workers, a change in owner or in governance could mean different. Among the more practical consequences were altered investment patterns in on-ground infrastructure. Bores, fences, and yards require ongoing expenditure. When budgets tightened or priorities changed under new ownership structures, maintenance could be deferred. Such postponements are visible in correspondence and station ledgers where available, notes about repairs delayed, requests for contractor assistance, or appeals to regional agents. For local contractors and suppliers, reduced maintenance meant less work, and for station workers it could mean harder labor conditions or increased risk during musters. These practical shifts remind us that pastoral management is as much about upkeep as about seasonal operation. Community life also absorbed the consequences. Sporting clubs, shows, and local institutions that benefited from station sponsorship or patronage sometimes found that financial support altered under different ownership. Where a family had previously been closely engaged in civic affairs, trustees or institutional owners might adopt a more distant posture. The social fabric of a town, its councils, committees, and volunteer groups, could thus feel the effects of a change in stewardship. Contemporary minutes, local newspapers, and community records provide glimpses of how civic relationships evolved when the visible face of a property's patronage receded or shifted. It is essential to separate the experience of ordinary people from the decisions made in offices, land registries, or family drawing rooms. Workers and towns did not control sales or estate restructuring, yet their livelihoods and rhythms were shaped by those decisions. The documentary record underscores that most operational change unfolded through incremental adjustments in work routines, contracts, and local investment, rather than through single dramatic ruptures. Where multiple properties were reconfigured within a region, the accumulated adjustments could produce a palpable sense of economy. At times, new owners announced plans to modernize or invest. Such statements, recorded in press notices and correspondence, occasionally translated into on-the-ground improvements that sustained or increased local employment. In other cases, the priority for incoming proprietors was different, treating land as part of a portfolio rather than an operating concern, and that implied different outcomes for workers and towns. The contrast between promises and practical outcomes is part of the record. Some transfers renewed local investment, others introduced a period of recalibration for communities. Ultimately, this chapter shows that the pastoral system's public image of steady homesteads and seasonal ritual rested on continuous human effort. The ledger and the map record ownership and geography, but the living work, the musters, the maintenance, the local trade, is what kept the wheels turning. As ownership forms shifted, the burden of adaptation fell on those who carried the work: station hands, contractors, storekeepers, and Indigenous laborers whose skills and labor sustained the network. Their experience frames the human stakes of the ledger's changes and sets the stage for examining the tangible remnants and archives that preserve the story of both power and labor. The places that remember. A veranda door with peeling paint, a faded sign nailed to a fence post, a ledger opened under glass in a climate-controlled room. These are the surfaces where the past becomes visible. Physical sites and documents hold the story in ways that words alone cannot. Homesteads, muster yards, and town museums keep traces of operation, while maps and ledgers record the practical work of holding country. Some homesteads still stand as built reminders, slab kitchens, corrugated roofs and rows of outbuildings that show how a station functioned day to day. Muster yards and stock routes remain on the landscape as routes and fences, and even a disused rail siding can tell a story about how stock reached market. In regional museums and local historical societies, photographs, advertisements, and family papers provide receipt moments, images, and entries that corroborate the patterns we've described on the ledger and the map. Archives are equally important. Station ledgers, maps, and correspondence preserved in state and national collections give concrete evidence of ownership, operations, and the choices made over time. These documents make visible the administrative side of pastoral life, requests for contractors, notes about bore repairs, lists of runs. Where such items are available, they offer direct proof of how land was managed, recorded, and reorganized. Plaques, place names, and local commemorations also shape memory. Roads, halls, or showground sponsorships that carry a station or family name anchor that presence in civic space. For towns that grew up around the pastoral economy, these markers are part of how community identity remembers the past. Visually, these places give the film its strongest images: homestead interiors, ledger pages, map overlays, museum cases, and town streets. They show continuity, the built environment that sustained life on country, and they show change, where maintenance, ownership, or use has shifted. Taken together, physical sites and archival records offer a way to read both power and labor in the landscape, and to trace how decisions on paper translated into work on the ground. What remains visible will be crucial evidence as we weigh the legacy of land-based wealth and ask what it meant for people and place. The next stage of the story moves from these surviving traces to interpretation, what the patterns of ownership and labor tell us about long-term influence, public memory, and the responsibilities those patterns impose. What the name still means. A name can outlast a ledger. When people speak of a pastoral family or a station, they are often invoking layers of place, labor, and public memory that persist beyond legal arrangements. That persistence is part physical, homesteads, roads, place names, and archived papers, and part cultural, held in local stories, regional press, and institutional references. The question is what those traces tell us about long-term power and whose interests that power served. On the evidence available, the Kidman name became woven into regional identity through repeated, visible presence, homesteads that hosted musters, sponsorship of local events, and routine commercial relationships with towns. These public markers created familiarity and social standing. For neighbors, suppliers, and workers, the name signaled an anchor in the local economy. For historians, the same signals document how landholding translated into social influence. That recognition is part of the old money mechanism, slow accumulation of assets in place that produces not just income but social capital. At the same time, archives and material traces complicate a simple story of prestige. Ledgers, maps, and correspondence preserved in state and local collections show the operational burdens and legal forms that underpinned landholding, estate papers, trust documents, and records of transactions that indicate how holdings were managed and, at times, restructured. These records are essential for understanding how long-term control was maintained or altered, and they reveal that old money was as much about administration and law as it. Cultural memory is not uniform. In towns, the station name might be carved into a showground gate or remembered in an annual fair. In archives, it appears in neat script on property transfers. For Indigenous communities, the overlay of that name onto country represents a different set of meanings: access, labor, disruption, and continuity that deserve careful, place-specific attention and meaningful consultation. Any full account must weigh institutional memory against those other perspectives. What survives of the name's influence is therefore mixed. Some physical markers and institutional references endure, administrative records show continuity of ownership forms, and community memory records both ties of employment and the social rhythms the stations created. At the same time, the material evidence points to transformations, legal and managerial shifts that altered how decisions were made and how land functioned in regional economies. Interpreting these traces leads to a broader conclusion about land-based old money in Australia. It is a form of influence that operates quietly through place and institutions, sustained by practical management, legal frameworks, and social recognition. The name endures in landscape and archive, but so do questions about who benefited and who adapted when maps were redrawn. Those questions bring us back to the people who lived these changes and to the records that document both power and its consequences. A former station hand's photograph, a town notice board, a ledger under glass, these are the ways people keep the past. The stations built networks of work and town trade, and ordinary Australians carried that labour and those rituals forward. Over time, legal structures and market pressures reshaped ownership and management, changing how communities linked to the land. Some institutions and names remain in local memory and archives, other details require further research and listening. If your family or community has a story connected to this landscape, share it below. We want local corrections, names, and suggestions for future episodes.